Many states across the country are making the efforts to legalize or decriminalize drug use for their population. This idea is rather controversial to many, but comes with significant benefits, and therefore, the state of South Carolina should push to decriminalize the use of drugs within the state. To start, it is important to specify what I mean by the decriminalization of drugs. This will be a change in the drug laws that makes the simple possession of all drugs no longer a criminal offense. This does not by any means make these drugs legal, meaning that they still cannot be legally sold or even owned within South Carolina. But the possession of drugs in South Carolina would no longer carry a criminal charge, meaning that in place of arrest and the stain on an individual's criminal record, there will be a fine given out for possession, much more available and widespread federal rehab programs in place of the normal jail time that comes with drug possession now. The current drug laws in the state are very harmful to the population and often lead to the perpetration of addiction instead of solving the problem. There are also significant issues with the way that these drug laws negatively affect minorities and lead to them being targeted at a much higher rate than white people in the state. In an article written by Gregory Yee on April 20th, 2020 for the Post and Courier titled "SC has the highest drug arrest rate for marijuana offenses," reports say, he states that the numbers paint a stark picture, with 7 South Carolina counties included in the top 20 nationwide for cannabis arrests, according to the report released Monday by the American Civil Liberties Union, which was based on FBI data. Black Charleston County residents were 4.2 times more likely to be arrested for the charge compared with whites, according to the report. This is a major flaw with the current state of our state's drug laws, and decriminalizing drugs within the state of South Carolina would go a long way towards fixing these issues. With drugs decriminalized, in this case specifically marijuana, there would be much less arrests on minorities in the state and work to reduce the racist implementations that our current laws hold. Another major flaw in the current drug laws present in South Carolina is the ineffectiveness of prisons for drug addicts. There are 2 major flaws with imprisoning people for the possession of drugs. The first major flaw comes in the form of overcrowded prisons. There is a huge problem with overcrowded prisons currently, and a large volume of inmates are in jail due to non-violent drug offenses such as simple possession. NORML published an article on November 21st, 2007 titled "Decriminalizing Pot Will Reduce Prison Population, Have No Adverse Impact on Public Safety," study says. In this article, they state that decriminalizing illicit drugs, along with the enacting modest reforms in sentencing and parole, would save taxpayers an estimated $20 billion per year and reduce the prison population from 1.5 million to just below 700,000. I will concede that this article is definitely not super recent, but the rates of drug arrests have only gone up since 2007 in South Carolina, so the impact of decriminalization would only be greater now when it comes to the reduction in the overcrowding of prisons. Now that the negative effects of criminalized drugs are established, I will propose a plan to make decriminalizing drugs possible. The first step in this plan is to simply implement a fine for the possession of drugs as opposed to sending non-violent drug offenders to jail. Instead of jail time, a fine will prevent the overcrowding of prisons with individuals who do not pose a threat or a danger to society. Also, for harder drugs that can cause significant harm and most often lead to addiction such as heroin, meth, cocaine, crack, etc., I propose a rehabilitation track instead of jail time. No one should have to lead a life of addiction on hard drugs, but sending people to prison for drug use will not stop their addiction, only create a pause in the addiction. And ultimately, the goal here is to prevent people from having an addiction, not lock them up and punish them for it. In addition to this, most people with a criminal record, especially a criminal record with significant jail time on it, have an incredibly hard time finding a job once they're released from prison. This means that people who are addicted to drugs and had to face jail time will often not be able to find a stable job once out of prison, and this in turn perpetuates their cycle of addiction. According to an article from March 8, 2021, from Oxford Rehabilitation Center, titled "Rehabilitation versus Incarceration, Rehabilitation in the Criminal Justice System," the NAACP reports that a criminal record can reduce the likelihood of a job offer or job callback by close to 50%. This means people emerging from prisons may find it hard to get jobs that they need to support their families, and the pressure they might feel due to poverty can be a major trigger for relapse. Financial woes could even push some people to return to dealing drugs. This is a major problem in our society, and the decriminalization of drugs in South Carolina would would help ensure that members of our state who are nonviolent and do not pose a threat to anyone else can still get a job once they have been caught with drugs. Also, with my proposal of a rehabilitation system as opposed to jail time, these people would much more confidently say that they are over their addiction due to actual professional help to quit their drug use, instead of coming out of a cruel environment where they are forced to quit cold turkey and not given the proper care and proper training to stay sober. People who are addicted to drugs in decriminalized states can be sent to rehab and cured instead of punished. This will of course come with some challenges in terms of funding, but I have a system plan that I believe will be beyond effective in funding an increase in rehabilitation centers throughout the state of South Carolina. The first part of this plan comes from substantially increasing the sales tax on tobacco. According to a graphic created by Tax Policy Center on June 18, 2020, the tax revenue from South Carolina generated by tobacco tax is only $26,383,000, which is one of the lowest in the country. This comes out to around 57 cents for a pack of cigarettes. According to the same graphic, the national average tax on a pack of cigarettes is $1.97. With an increase in South Carolina's tobacco tax to the national average, there will be a massive increase in tax revenue that can be put towards building and running the new rehabilitation centers in the state, totaling over $80 million in increased revenue. This is a very good start for the funding, but there will be more necessary funding. This money can come from the new decriminalized system, since there will no longer be arrest for the possession of drugs without the clear and proven intent to distribute them or harm to others. Anyone who is caught with possession will only face a fine, much like a speeding ticket. Therefore, I propose that the money produced from the drug possession fines be directly funneled back into the rehabilitation centers. This can work with the increased revenue from tobacco tax to completely pay for and sponsor the continued running of rehabilitation centers.
How much would any given fine for the possession of drugs be?
The fines will work much like our current system for giving out speeding tickets. There will be a number of factors that go into the fines. There would be different levels of fines based on the amount of possession, as well as how many previous fines the individual has gotten, and extreme circumstances such as the possibility that they are endangering others. For example, with this last one, a person who has younger children on the same property that they own drugs on. This means that the child may easily be able to access these drugs and find harm, or that if the parent is on a harder drug such as meth, heroin, etc., they could cause danger to the child by being on these drugs.
And when it comes to using these fines for the funding of rehabilitation centers, what percentage of the money earned from these fines would be used for this purpose explicitly?
Under my proposed plan, all of the money gained from these fines will go directly back into the rehab centers. Since this is a new fine paired with a new form of funding, there should not be any budget issues that arrive from new money that we make going into a new project.
You claimed that putting drug users and drug addicts in jail or prison is a bad way to deter these people from using their drug of choice. Why do you say that this is a bad method when these individuals do not have access to drugs in jail?
When people are put into prison because of an addiction, they are placed into a cold and cruel environment. They are simply separated from their substance of addiction, but they are never given the proper tools or training to actually combat the addiction that they are dealing with. Because of this, when they leave prison, they are right back into an environment where these drugs are readily accessible, and they can very easily get addicted to them again. With rehab, they are trained and prepared to re-enter society and no longer be dependent on drugs and be able to face the temptation to take them without actually doing it.
The decriminalization of drugs in the state of South Carolina would not fix all the issues that Bryson claimed that it would. And furthermore, the decriminalization of drugs in the state of South Carolina would bring about more serious issues that would outweigh the possible benefits of decriminalization. To top it all off, the decriminalization of drugs would be much more difficult to fund in the state of South Carolina than Bryson made it out to be. Although rehabilitation may be a better approach for dealing with addiction than jail time is, trying to fund rehabilitation programs in South Carolina in order for decriminalization to actually work as intended will be practically impossible. Bryson's plan for funding the rehabilitation centers in the state of South Carolina includes an increased tobacco tax and eventually transitioning to using money from fines collected from the new decriminalization laws. This plan runs into some moral issues and would not bring in nearly enough money to keep up with rehabilitation centers throughout the state. Earlier this year, Rachel Alexander and Safara Harrell made the following claim in the KGW8 news article, Oregon launches into expanded addiction treatment with little evidence of what works. The biggest success, I think, of 110 is decriminalization, said Reginald Richardson, director of the State Alcohol and Drug Policy Commission. But in terms of creating a system where people can get more treatment, which is what was advertised, that's absolutely not what's going to be happening. Richardson and local treatment providers say any improvement in the treatment system depends on how legislators implement Measure 110. Tara Hurst, executive director of Oregon Health Justice Recovery Alliance, which advocated for Measure 110, said Oregon hasn't seen what it looks like to have an adequately funded system to address substance abuse. She said many of the system's flaws stem from a lack of money, and addressing that problem is the first step in fixing the system. Hurst, who's in recovery, said there is some unfounded fear that the measure will in fact reduce addiction services. Since marijuana is also legalized in Oregon, they have been using money from marijuana sales to fund the rehabilitation centers put in place after the new decriminalization laws were introduced. But even with the extra source of funding, Oregon is having trouble funding enough money to actually have effective rehabilitation centers around the state, which is what was initially advertised and was what is necessary in order for the advertised decriminalization system to have any sort of merit and to be the slightest bit effective. In the state of South Carolina, where marijuana is still illegal, money from marijuana sales cannot be used to fund rehabilitation centers, which will make the prospect of funding these rehabilitation centers that much more difficult. Bryson proposed that an increased tobacco tax should be put in place as a source of funding, but this just brings up a moral dilemma. His plan relies on the tobacco addiction of others in order to fund rehabilitation centers that are treating other types of addicts. If the purpose of decriminalization is to be more focused on rehabilitating addicts rather than neglecting them, a system whose funding relies on tobacco addiction is not morally ideal. Either this moral dilemma would be an issue, or the increased tobacco tax would actually deter tobacco addicts and users from buying tobacco as much, just as Bryson claimed it would. But if this is the case, there is no way that this funding method would bring in enough money, and the state of South Carolina would be in a similar place that Oregon is in with their lack of funding for effective rehabilitation centers. Either one of these outcomes are equally likely with Bryson's proposed tobacco tax increase to fund rehabilitation centers in the state of South Carolina. But neither of these outcomes are ideal outcomes, as one results in a morally flawed funding system, and the other results in not enough funding, and in turn, ineffective rehabilitation centers. However, for the purposes of my upcoming rebuttals, I will assume that Bryson's plan to decriminalize drugs in the state of South Carolina will receive proper funding. Under the assumption that his proposed plan will obtain the necessary funding, Bryson claimed that the decriminalization of drugs in the state of South Carolina would eliminate historic racist patterns when it comes to drug-related offenses, but this is simply not true. In fact, the decriminalization of drugs in the state of South Carolina would exacerbate racism by hiding it. On April 10, 2020, Nikolai Anguilov made the following claim in the Conservation article titled, "The Unintended Consequences of Marijuana Decriminalization." Arrest data show that in Colorado, legalizing recreational use for anyone 21 and over caused a significant increase in the arrest rates of African Americans and Hispanics under that legal age limit. At the same time, arrests for underage whites decreased. In Washington state, arrests on all marijuana charges fell by 90% between 2008 and 2014, but hazard rates for African Americans remained unchanged. This means they were still twice as likely as whites to be arrested on marijuana charges. In other words, decriminalization has done little to change historical patterns in national marijuana arrest trends. We all know that racism has been a major problem in the United States for a long time, and it still is a major problem. But this data shows that the decriminalization of drugs is not a reliable way to tackle the issue of historic racism. If racism is to be truly eradicated from our society, it is necessary to attack it from the source, because trying to correct racist trends on small scales and within narrow topics such as the decriminalization of drugs has proven to be ineffective at fixing the issue and is only shown to relocate the issue. Although the decriminalization of drugs in the state of South Carolina would help with the issue of overcrowded prisons, it will also take away the fear of legal prosecution for the experimentation of drugs. This means that more people who are genetically predisposed to addiction are more likely to experiment with drugs, and the criminalization of marijuana especially will lead to more underage experimentation and usage of marijuana. On April 10, 2020, Nikolai Anguilov made the following claim in the conservation article titled "The Unintended Consequences of Marijuana Decriminalization." Some drug laws related to marijuana are easing. As of early 2020, 25 states have introduced decriminalization reforms, with 11 states allowing adult recreational use. Such reforms directly impact the adults 21 years of age and older, but they also have indirect effects on younger Americans. Even though marijuana is still legal for people under 21, evidence is emerging that decriminalization is increasing the number of kids who consume weed illegally. As I wrote in my book, young people have always been the main buyers of marijuana. Smoking marijuana has become an important part of growing up for many U.S. teenagers, a fact not acknowledged by any marijuana reformed advocacy analysis. Additionally, crime data show that even in the most permissive legal environments, minority youth continue to be disproportionately arrested and convicted on marijuana charges. This data shows that the decriminalization of marijuana is directly related to underage marijuana usage, which is still illegal, and it shows yet another example of the exacerbation of historic racism patterns, as minority youth are disproportionately arrested. Not only is the racism and increased rate of arrested youth an issue, the usage of drugs for underage people is an issue in and of itself. This is because substance abuse affects teen brain development by interfering with neurotransmitters and damaging connections within the brain, which can lead to various lifelong issues, such as memory loss and the inability to experience pleasure. On top of the biological and physiological disadvantages that underage drug use can cause, there are other serious side effects as well, such as criminal records that cannot be expunged, wasted academic opportunities, damaged relationship with friends and family, and much more. On top of all of this, those who are more genetically susceptible to drug addiction will be more likely to experiment with and try drugs that they wouldn't have otherwise tried due to the fear of legal prosecution. Therefore, these people would be much more likely to get addicted. So, while the decriminalization of drugs in the state of South Carolina may be promoting rehabilitation instead of jail time as a way to treat addiction, decriminalization will also increase the number of potential addicts and underage drug users, especially with underage marijuana usage.
I think we can both agree that drug use, especially marijuana, is already extremely prevalent within people under the age of 21. Due to how easily accessible drugs already are and the prevalence of their use in this demographic, do you think that decriminalizing drugs in South Carolina will actually have any significant effect on the use of drugs in minors?
Yes, there is more and more evidence coming out that proves that the decriminalization of drugs will increase underage drug usage. For example, the state of California passed legislation to decriminalize marijuana in 2010, and in a study published on January 14, 2015, titled Trends in Use of Attitudes Toward Marijuana Among Youth Before and After Decriminalization, the Case of California 2007 to 2013, it was found that in 2012 and onwards, California 12th graders, as compared to their peers in other states, became A, 25% more likely to have used marijuana in the past 30 days, B, 20% less likely to perceive regular marijuana use as a great health risk, C, 20% less likely to strongly disapprove of regular marijuana use, and D, about 60% more likely to expect to be using marijuana 5 years in the future.
Earlier in your speech, you claimed that decriminalizing drugs would not have any effect on the racist implementation of drug enforcement, but under my proposed plan, there would be less minorities being put behind bars for the use of drugs. In what way would this create another problem like you claimed that it would?
Well, there's no downside to having less minorities in jail. However, while the decriminalization of drugs may be helping with this particular issue, the decriminalization of drugs also brings about other issues, like increased arrest rates of African Americans and Hispanics under the legal age limit for the possession of drugs.
In Jerry's speech, he spends a lot of time attempting to dismantle my funding plan. One of his main arguments is that using a tax increase on cigarettes is exploiting one addiction to try to fix another one. This is simply not the case. The main point of the money from tobacco tax is to fund the building of the rehabilitation centers. This will be the greatest expense with my plan. Once the centers are built, the price to maintain them will be much lower on a yearly basis than it will be when they have to be built, because they will only have to be staffed and ran, not rebuilt all the time. Because of this, I believe that an increase in the tobacco tax will not only be beneficial in funding the rehabilitation centers, but will also reduce the amount of tobacco use over time, successfully curbing another form of addiction. Most likely, tobacco sales will not immediately fall when the tax increase takes place, since it takes time for people to kick an addiction. This means that there will still be a very large increase in the amount of revenue generated from the tobacco tax increase, which can fund the building of the rehab centers. After people realize that they will be spending much more money on tobacco though, the sales could begin to curve downward, at which point there would already be substantial funding for the rehabilitation centers to be built, and we would still have money coming in from tobacco sales, because without making tobacco illegal, the sales will never quit. But if there is an overall reduction in the amount of people buying tobacco, that is definitely an upside, and we can still have funding towards this system. Another main point of Jerry's speech is that decriminalizing drugs will not actually help a lot of the systematic problems with the current enforcement of drug laws. However, according to a recent article from the Post and Courier, this is simply not the case. In the article titled, "SC has nation's second highest arrest rate for marijuana offenses," published on April 20th, 2020, Gregory Yee writes, "Despite the picture painted by the report, officials in Charleston County said they've been working hard to implement reforms, at least on the local level. Law enforcement and criminal justice officials have worked through the county's Criminal Justice Coordinating Council to reduce the inmate population of the A1 Cannon Detention Center in North Charleston for several years. Part of the strategy is to issue citations for low-level offenses like simple possession of marijuana, rather than arrest those people and book them into jail. Charleston County experienced substantial reductions in jail use for lower-level municipal and magistrate charges," said Christy Danford, the council's project director. "For instance, in 2014, there were 1,576 single-charge bookings for simple possession of marijuana. By 2019, it reduced by 93% to 109. As a result of the council's reforms, simple possession of marijuana is no longer the most frequent charge in booking at Charleston County Jail," Danford said. Charleston Police Chief Luther Reynolds said his focus, and that of his department, is on lowering violent crime. I could make 100 arrests for kids hanging out on the corner for simple possession, and it'll have minimal impact. Or I could arrest someone who's shooting our communities, and it's going to have a huge positive impact," Reynolds said. "We have to be strategic, and we have to be in the areas where we have problems. The actions that the police force have taken in Charleston County are the actions that will be required statewide under my plan for decriminalization. And this is a great example of this plan working in the state of South Carolina. I can concede that in this example, it's from only one county in South Carolina, and this county doesn't represent the entirety of the state. Charleston is much more progressive than a lot of the rest of South Carolina. But it is still the best and most accurate predictor of the effects that the decriminalization of drugs would have in the state of South Carolina. Another main point of Jerry's rebuttal is that decriminalizing drugs will lead to a higher arrest rate in minorities under the legal age. This may be the case in states where certain drugs are legal, but with the proposed system, it would not be a criminal offense to possess drugs, so a minor would not face arrest for the possession of drugs. Because the point of this system is to get people with a drug problem help, it would not make sense to jail a minor for the possession of drugs if we're not going to jail an adult for the possession. They should instead be given the same amount of help, if not even more help because they're so young, than an adult would get. Because of this, decriminalizing drugs in South Carolina would in fact not lead to a higher arrest rate for underage minorities in the state, but could lead to more opportunities for them to seek the help that they need when they're addicted to drugs.
The majority of evidence and examples that Bryson has used to support his plan for the decriminalization of drugs in the state of South Carolina comes from states like Oregon, where the decriminalization of drugs has already been put into action. But Oregon and South Carolina are very different states with very different people within them. The attitudes of both South Carolina state officials and the public in the state of South Carolina would not allow the proposed plan to decriminalize drugs in the state of South Carolina to work as intended and to be effective. On November 30th, 2020, the FITS news article, "Marijuana Legalization, Medical or Recreational, Still Faces Long Odds in South Carolina," made the following claim. Republican Governor Henry McMaster has vowed to veto a decriminalization bill in the event that one was to land on his desk. McMaster has called marijuana a detriment to society and claimed its legalization would be entering very dangerous territory. If McMaster is true to his word, medical marijuana supporters would need to muster 2/3 majorities in both the SC House of Representatives and the SC Senate to override his veto. This shows that a decriminalization bill passing in the state of South Carolina is highly unrealistic, as Governor McMaster does not sound like he's going to be passing a decriminalization bill anytime soon. If McMaster is going to veto any decriminalization bill that comes to his desk while he's in office, decriminalization supporters would need to obtain a 2/3 majority vote in both South Carolina House of Representatives and the South Carolina Senate, which is also quite unrealistic. Although the possibility of a decriminalization bill passing in the state of South Carolina is highly unlikely, I will assume that it can and does pass for the purposes of my following arguments. Under the assumption that a decriminalization bill does pass in the state of South Carolina, it will not be accepted well by the public. South Carolina has been one of the most conservative states in the country ever since the United States gained their independence from Great Britain, and for the most part, that has not changed. There are a few areas in South Carolina, such as Charleston and Columbia, that tend to have more liberal, progressive views as a whole, but the vast majority of people throughout the state of South Carolina tend to have conservative views. Therefore, most of these South Carolinians will be opposed to the decriminalization of drugs throughout the state. Even if they are not able to affect whether or not a decriminalization policy is implemented, they will be able to affect how effective such a system would be. Regardless of how many people are put into rehabilitation centers, if they are unwilling to be rehabilitated, the system will not work. If the South Carolina population rejects the ideal of decriminalization and rehabilitation, then the plan for decriminalization of drugs in the state of South Carolina will be ineffective. Finally, there have not been a wide variety of places to have gone through with the decriminalization of drugs, and the places that have decriminalized drugs have not had it in place for a long time. While there are some effects of decriminalization that have been determined, there are possibly many unknown effects of decriminalization that have yet to be determined, and these unknown effects could very well be adverse. On April 23rd, 2018, the Foundation Recovery Network article, Pros and Cons of Decriminalization, made the following claim. The fear of the unknown, how culture would change if drugs were decriminalized and how our country would handle it, is a strong factor for those who are in favor of keeping drug use designated as a criminal offense. There are too many factors that could have ongoing negative effects within U.S. culture to lend any excitement towards any potential positive changes. Most Americans do not come face to face with drugs or with drug addicts until someone in their lives is affected. This lack of familiarity can lead to fear of the unknown. Those who consider substance abuse morally or spiritually objectionable often fear that the decriminalization sends a confusing message of partial endorsement for such dangerous choices to young, impressionable people. While the decriminalization of drugs in the state of South Carolina may be the best option, it is too early to make that decision now. All of the true long-term effects, both good and bad, of the decriminalization of drugs have not had enough time to take shape and become widely known. Before a decision is made in the state of South Carolina, at least 5 more years of observing and recording effects of other regions where drugs have been decriminalized is necessary. After this has happened, then another conversation can be had about whether or not the state of South Carolina should decriminalize drugs. But as of right now, there is not enough evidence to make a decision in favor of decriminalization in good conscience, because from the data that has been collected, the cons of decriminalization outweigh the pros of decriminalization.
Decriminalizing drugs in the state of South Carolina is a very important step in fixing a drug addiction crisis that is prevalent in the state. Allowing drugs to be decriminalized would not only fix many problems such as overcrowded prisons and an alarmingly high rate of minorities being put behind bars, but it would also lead to people getting the help that they need in order to kick their addictions. It is crucial that we get drug addicts the help that they need and not punish them for an addiction that they can no longer help themselves with. Decriminalizing drugs will end the possibility for someone's future to be ruined because of negative stigmas around drugs and a stain on their criminal record, and lead to more understanding and caring society. While South Carolina may not be a very progressive state, and this idea may not be the most popular plan to the public, the only way to affect progress in the public is to cause progress in our legislation. There are many unknowns in our state when it comes to decriminalizing drugs, but with a system that is currently broken and promotes a cycle of addiction, trying something bold and new is the best path that we can take to a better society and a better state.
Overall, the state of South Carolina should not decriminalize drugs. right now, because the proposed funding plans has major flaws, decriminalization does not help with historically racist drug arrest patterns. In fact, it only exacerbates the issue of racism by hiding it and relocating racist trends. Decriminalization promotes underage drug experimentation and usage due to the lack of fearing legal prosecution. The majority of public opinion throughout the state of South Carolina would not allow the proposed decriminalization system to be effective, and there are too many unknown effects of the decriminalization of drugs to make a good decision on the issue right now. In a few years, when there is more information about the true effects of decriminalization and sufficient evidence to back it up, the conversation about whether or not to decriminalize drugs in the state of South Carolina can be revisited. But the little evidence that has been collected so far shows that the negative effects of decriminalization outweigh the positive effects of decriminalization. Therefore, as of right now, the state of South Carolina should not decriminalize drugs.